I was asked to talk about intergovernmental and communitarian perspectives on the European Union's common foreign and security policy. So this is what I will do. As you know, I'm sure, the nature and the characteristics of the European Union as a polity is contested. Scholars from different theoretical perspectives debate what is the most adequate way to describe as well as to account.
Sorry for intervening. Could you press F5 button? This would allow us to see your presentation at the full screen.
So F5.
F5 at the keyboard.
Okay.
Yes, good, excellent, thank you.
Okay, good.
Thank you.
Yes, the nature and characteristics of the European Union as a polity are contested, but I would say that a majority of scholars would agree that the European Union is not a state, but it's something more than an international organization. The member states are bound by common laws, subject to decisions made by qualified majority voting. Supranational institutions wield considerable influence on domestic political decisions in the member states. There is, however, considerable scholarly debate on how to account for this state of integration, as well as how deep and stable the system of the European Union actually is. When it comes to the European Union's common foreign and security policy, the situation is quite different in terms of scholarly discussions. This policy field is an integral part of the Union, but it's not subject to the standard decision-making procedures of the European Union. Most importantly, the supranational institutions, the European Commission, the European Parliament, the European Court of Justice have less influence over decisions in this policy field than in most others. So the standard description of the EU's common foreign and security policy is that it remains intergovernmental. So perhaps this part of the European Union is not beyond an international organization, and it's certainly not anything like a state. And actually, when it comes to accounting for the situation in foreign and security policy, most of the scholarly efforts have been put into accounting for and describing why there is so little integration in this field, rather than accounting for integration actually taking place. Nevertheless, there are some scholars who suggest that the European Union has moved beyond intergovernmentalism, also in the area of foreign and security policy. There's no consensus on a single concept that would describe what the common foreign and security policy is if it's not intergovernmental. But I think Nikolai chose a very apt term by pointing to communitarian perspectives on the common foreign and security policy as an alternative to the intergovernmental perspective, because it depicts a sense of community and perhaps also makes us remember that there was something called the European community at a time, which described the supranational part of the European Union. So what I want to do in the lecture is to discuss to what extent it's reasonable to describe the common foreign and security policy as intergovernmental or not, and what might be alternative accounts if we conclude that there is indeed a move beyond intergovernmentalism, also in this policy field. So now I have to figure out how to move my slides. Yes, I managed. So this is what you see here is an overview of the key parts of the lecture. I will first talk about intergovernmentalism as a standard account of the common foreign and security policy. Then I will discuss limits to intergovernmentalism. And lastly, I will raise some theoretical and principled challenges to the observations that the European Union has moved beyond intergovernmentalism in this particular policy field. But first, I would like to say a little bit about why we should at all bother with this question of whether or not the common foreign and security policy is beyond intergovernmentalism. And I would suggest that if it is beyond intergovernmentalism, this gives rise to some interesting theoretical puzzles, some normative dilemmas, and it's also a debate that I think links quite well into the actual political discussions regarding the role of the European Union. Firstly, with regard to the theoretical puzzles that would arise if the European Union has moved beyond intergovernmentalism in this field, are linked to challenges to the established views of foreign policy, as well as of what kind of cooperation is possible in international affairs. The core assumption in all studies of international relations is, of course, that the states are the main actors and that the regulatory apparatus that makes foreign policy within states is organized in a fairly hierarchical way, and that decisions are made on the basis of an idea of what is in the national interest. So if the European Union has moved beyond intergovernmentalism in this particular policy field, we might need to develop new theories and new concepts to account for this phenomenon, and perhaps also rethink the nature of state foreign policies. In addition, some normative challenges would arise in the sense that if the European Union is beyond intergovernmentalism in this field, this would mean that there has been a change in the distribution of power, not only between states, but also between states and collective institutions in Europe. So a relevant question is who then decides, and to whom are those who decide accountable? Thirdly, this discussion of beyond intergovernmentalism or not also touches on important political debates and on the standard expectation, which is that we should not, or the standard prediction that we should not expect much of the European Union in terms of foreign policy. And that the European Union does not have a strong effect on international affairs in general. So for third states who want to talk to Europe, the classic assumption is that if you want to do that, go to France, Germany, or the UK, the larger states. But perhaps if the European Union is more of a collective entity in foreign policy, there will also be a need to talk to the representatives of the Union itself. So that's with regard to why bother? Why is this discussion at all relevant in scholarly and political terms? Now, I will move on to say a little bit about the intergovernmental perspective and what it actually entails. Now, intergovernmentalism is a general concept describing how interaction between sovereign states can be regulated, and it does so with a focus on cooperation while maintaining the right of states to govern themselves without external interference. So it's cooperation while sovereignty remains intact. But it's not a concept that pertains only to the European Union. It's also applicable to other international organizations. So the assumption is that intergovernmental cooperation protects states from interference in their domestic affairs, but nevertheless facilitates cooperation with other states. Surprisingly, there has been little focus on the actual principles that regulate cooperation in an intergovernmental system. What kind of mechanisms, norms, and rules make it possible for states to cooperate within such a structure and at the same time ensure their autonomy? It's as if we sort of take for granted that we know exactly what intergovernmentalism is and that we know what to look for when we are in front of a phenomenon that may be called intergovernmental. I will suggest some indicators for that are more detailed for identifying an intergovernmental entity a little bit later on. But first, I would like to stress again that the main focus when it comes to intergovernmentalism has tended to be on accounting for all the limitations to cooperation that come with intergovernmentalism, rather than accounting for the kind of cooperation that takes place. So how do scholars account for the limitations to cooperation in an intergovernmental perspective? There's several arguments, perhaps three that have been most prevalent. Firstly, that the limits to cooperation and integration in foreign and security policy from the intergovernmental perspective, the limits are linked to the particular nature of foreign and security policy. It's seen as a special kind of politics aimed at maximizing the common good for national citizens, so untouchable in the minds of policymakers in terms of moving into closer commitments with other states. It's crucial to the survival of the state itself, which also is seen as a hindrance to close integration in the area of foreign policy. Secondly, scholars often point to the importance and strength of national histories, national traditions, and that these conflict to such an extent that it's impossible to conceive of the kind of decision-making system that you might have in agricultural policy or in trade to implement that in the area of foreign and security policy. And thirdly, of course, it's argued that there is a lack of incentives for European states to integrate closely in foreign and security policy, given the existence of NATO, which ensures that security is taken care of elsewhere. So a particular nature of foreign policy, long-standing and conflicting traditions of foreign policy, and a lack of incentives are the kinds of explanations that we usually find as to why member states have decided to remain in an intergovernmental mode in foreign and security policy. But I mentioned that some scholars tend to argue that the European Union has taken some steps beyond intergovernmentalism. And in order to discuss whether this might be a correct observation, I suggest to look more closely at the specific expectations we have to an intergovernmental system, and to see if the core dimensions of such a system can actually be found in the European Union's foreign and security policy. So 3 dimensions are important. Firstly, the decision-making procedures. Secondly, the distribution of competences. And thirdly, the overarching purpose of the intergovernmental entity. In an intergovernmental entity, we expect the right to veto to be the core principle of decision making. So all states in an intergovernmental system have the right to veto decisions that it disagrees with. If the right to veto is replaced, for example, by majority voting, we must assume that the system has moved beyond intergovernmentalism. Secondly, distribution of competences. This pertains to what kind of authority can actually be transferred to collective institutions within an intergovernmental system. We usually assume that authority is mainly delegated to common institutions rather than being permanently transferred to them. So it should be possible for states in an intergovernmental system to take authority back. This means delegation of competences would have to be fairly delimited. There would have to be specific tasks that could be recuperated later on by the member states. In the European Union as such, we have seen with Brexit how incredibly complicated it is to do that. In foreign policy, it might be easier. We'll see. And the third dimension has to do with the overarching purpose of an intergovernmental entity. From an intergovernmental perspective, we usually expect that the main purpose of intergovernmental cooperation is to enable states to better take care of their own interests and ensure satisfaction of their own preferences. So the activities of the intergovernmental system will not go beyond that which can be sort of understood as being in the interest of the member states. So some research on the European Union suggests that when we look at how the foreign and security policy actually functions, it does not function according to these ideas that are elaborated here. So these observations, I would suggest, are core observations of a communitarian approach. So let's look more closely at that how does the common foreign and security policy actually function? Firstly, if we look at the first dimension, decision-making procedures, and the right to veto. Here, what we find is quite a lot of research, detailed research on the institutions and the functioning of the interaction between member states and the common institution. They find that the power to veto, while obviously a formal right, is not as central as one would expect. States report that they wait to make their decisions until they have spoken with their European partners. So one might suggest that the chain of decision-making at the national level is expanded to include conferring with other states. And there is a clear expectation among member states that you should contribute to establish a consensus rather than veto decisions straight away. So the norm, rather than being a veto, seems to be a consensus. And I have a quote here from Julian Howarth to illustrate the kinds of findings that these researchers who have interviewed policymakers across the different institutions, the kinds of findings they have. And this quote is then from one of the ambassadors who sit in the so-called Political and Security Committee in the European Union. And he or she says, if we have a wave of consensus and you are the only obstacle, then you have to have exceptionally good arguments to turn the tide. Sometimes colleagues have to say, yes, I understand everybody else, and I would love to agree, but I simply have to call home. So he calls home to his capital and comes back very often then and says, okay, we agree. So what this quote illustrates then is a change of perspective of member states facing the pressure from colleagues to agree to a decision that the ambassador to start with was instructed to disagree with. So this suggests that the power of the veto might actually be less important than what one would assume from an intergovernmental perspective. So we can discuss afterwards if this has changed since Julian Howarth made his interviews, bearing in mind that some of the newer member states seem more keen to use the veto than some of the older member states have been. So when it comes to the second issue on distribution of competences and the delegation of powers, the question is whether or not states can actually control the powers delegated to common institutions and whether or not they can take it back in principle if they should be unhappy with what happens at the European Union level. The departure from intergovernmentalism at this point has to do with what kind of powers are actually delegated to the European Union level. And the EU, as you probably know, has the power to make decisions on all aspects regarding foreign and security policy. So there is a general delegation of power to the common institutions, rather than a specific delegation of concrete tasks. Of course, the power to make decisions on all aspects related to foreign and security policy is not EU institutions' sole power. It is a power that it shares with the member states, but they do nevertheless have the power to initiate discussions and think about what to do across the entire spectrum of foreign and security policy. It was not like this in the early days of foreign and security policy cooperation, but today it is so. So this gives the EU institutions considerable room for discretion when thinking about what to do in foreign policy. Thirdly, when it comes to the overarching purpose of the intergovernmental entity, you may recall I suggested that this purpose in an intergovernmental entity is linked to the preferences and interests of the member states themselves. So the whole purpose of intergovernmental cooperation is to ensure that states are better equipped to fulfill their own preferences and interests when they cooperate with others than when they go it alone. Now, if we look at the overarching purpose of the EU's foreign and security policy, it is not to enable states to fulfill their interest. Rather, it is to fulfill European interests and values. So the overarching aim of the EU's foreign policy is to fulfill and follow European interests and values. And with the Lisbon Treaty, this was further reinforced in the sense that the treaty also demands that national foreign policies respect EU perspectives and values when they define their own initiatives in foreign affairs and in the area of security. So the European Union has established a higher order of European interests and values that states are bound by also in the area of foreign and security policy. And to ensure that these principles and values are respected, it has developed a set of common institutions that also contribute to shape foreign and security policy. So, to sum up on the question of whether or not we are beyond intergovernmentalism in the foreign and security policy, it seems that there are a number of limits and constraints on member states' foreign policy that do not quite match the expectations of an intergovernmental perspective. There are gaps and lacunas in the intergovernmentalist description of the CFSP. Most of all, we seem to observe a system of voluntary cooperation between member states. There are few sanctions available to collective institutions if member states choose not to follow common agreements. Nevertheless, the finding of most research is that states actually do comply with common decisions. So this leaves us with some theoretical puzzles. How can we account for this apparent transfer of power to the EU level? How can we account for a voluntary transfer of power? One that is not due to coercion, but to a voluntary adherence to norms and rules. Let's see. Now, the standard explanation, which is the first one on my list, bargaining, would still keep us within an intergovernmental perspective and within an intergovernmental account. So the proposition here would be that there are certain incentives, nevertheless, that have become stronger over the years and that provide a basis for a common desire for common action. Those incentives could be material, economic, and be linked to economies of scale. If we think of security and defense, more and more European states join forces not only in defense procurement, but also in developing common troops, battle groups, etc. And these reduces costs at the national level, but at the same time enable states to fulfill the same tasks as they would have fulfilled without cooperation. So economies of scale might be one incentive for such integration. There might also be political incentives, such as a fear of retaliation in case you, as a small European state, try to stand up against actions of a larger state outside of Europe. We have seen, for example, with regard to China, that smaller states can be targeted if they do not act in accordance with the expectation of Chinese authorities, for example, by criticizing human rights, etc., and being part of a collective entity such as the European Union may, in those situations, provide some more security, and it might be difficult for larger state to target a single actor and retaliate. So we could imagine that there are, at this time, at the present time of European politics, increasing incentives to cooperate. So what would this bargaining perspective then suggest? It would argue that on the basis of a common desire for joint action, states would sit down together to bargain, and the outcome of the bargain would be determined by the relative power of actors and the intensity of their preferences. So this goes back to a kind of liberal intergovernmentalist theory, such as that presented by Andrew Moravchik. In this perspective, then, the current level of institutionalization in the EU's foreign and security policy serves the interests of states and their constituents. So this would be the standard account for the process of integration and cooperation in the common foreign and security policy. As you have no doubt understood, I think there are some limitations to what this account can actually say with regards to those moves that are observed by a lot of scholars, those moves beyond intergovernmentalism. Most importantly, I would say that this account cannot account for the stability of cooperation and integration in this field, because it relies on this assumption of relative gains and the actors' desire to protect their own interest. You would expect, because the incentives are linked to calculations of costs and benefits, there is a risk of defection from cooperation when this calculation of costs and benefits changes. So this makes for a very unstable system of cooperation, and what we seem to observe is rather the opposite: long-term stability and gradual increase of cooperation and integration in this field. Another dimension that of the observations of a move beyond intergovernmentalism that is difficult to account for in this perspective has to do with short-term costs, short-term gains and long-term costs. While you might account for cooperation at a particular moment in time with this bargaining theory, what we see with the CFSP is that states bind themselves into cooperative arrangements in the long run. And these kind of binding agreements, they will entail costs at some point for states, unless, of course, you choose to defect. And this cost that comes from remaining within a long-term cooperative venture is more difficult to account for with the bargaining theory. So the second attempt at accounting for this move beyond intergovernmentalism is by drawing on the concept of socialization. Now, some scholars, Ben Tondra, Karolina Pomorska, Anna Junkos, and others have drawn on this concept to account for what happens in when the member states move beyond intergovernmentalism. They suggest that what has happened is a process, a longer-term process of socialization of states, by which they mean that their foreign policies have become more, the foreign policies of member states have become more similar over time. So they point to the long-term effect of interaction, regular daily interaction between member states, and argue that this has brought forward a common understanding, a sense of commonality and community, a sense of belonging to the same group. And on this basis, norms of what is appropriate behavior will then evolve. As Anna Hunkos and Karolina Pomorska have written, they argue socialization would lead group members to a consistent compliance with the group's norms. So they expect this socialization to account for the reluctance of member states to use the veto in decision-making processes. So the quote from Jolyon Haworth from the perspective of Pomorska and Hunkos can be accounted for with this idea of socialization. Socialization. You do what is expected of you as a member of a particular group. The challenge with this perspective is, most of all, I would suggest that it is theoretically underspecified. It's difficult to see what mechanism they can point to in order to explain why the norms that states within this group follow, why those norms have actually changed, because they do point to a change, even if it's a slow change. It's a change from thinking of yourself as representing the interests and values of a particular state towards representing not only that state, but also the interest and values of Europe or the European Union as a common group. So how does that socialization process actually work? What is the mechanism that triggers a change in the normative commitment of states? This is difficult to understand from the description of the theory of socialization. And it's also a bit difficult to understand in the same way as with the bargaining theory, why this would be so stable. So why would states choose to follow those norms? Why do they do what they consider to be appropriate when they don't actually have to do so? They are not coerced into do so. They make that choice themselves. So also an account that takes us some way to understand what might have happened in foreign and security policy, but that doesn't take us all the way to understand it. So I would suggest a third perspective that we can also observe in the literature on the EU's foreign policy, and that is the arguing perspective, which might complement some of the lacunas in the idea of socialization. So here, the starting point would be an understanding of actor rationality, actors as rational, but in a different way than what they would do when they talk of actors as rational in the bargaining perspective. In the bargaining perspective, a rational actor calculates costs and benefits and then chooses the path that is best suited to fulfill its own interest at the least cost. So in an arguing perspective, actors are rational if they are able to justify and explain what they do, and to make that explanation understandable and acceptable to other actors. So it's a very different way of thinking about rationality. It's an idea of rationality that is linked to a communicative process between actors. And thereby you can see that it does link up to the idea of socialization to some extent, but it might actually provide the mechanism that is missing in the theoretical mechanism, missing in the conception of socialization. It would suggest that actors would change position with regard to what to do or which norm to follow, EU norms or national norms or a mix, that they would do this based on an exchange of arguments where the relevance of a norm is rationally assessed. So not rationally assessed in terms of costs and benefits of following the norms, but in the sense of whether or not the norm is justifiable or not. So actors would follow the norm based on an idea that it is relevant and right. So three different paths to attempt to account for the moves beyond intergovernmentalism that are observed in some of the literature on the common foreign and security policy, where bargaining would still, in my view, keep us within the realm of intergovernmentalism. Socialization and arguing would contribute more to account for the move beyond intergovernmentalism. So I also mentioned in the beginning that in addition to the theoretical puzzles that might arise as a result of a move beyond intergovernmentalism, there would be some normative challenges related to questions of legitimacy. So if power has moved from the member states to EU institutions, this does give rise to a debate regarding the legitimacy of the legitimacy basis of EU foreign policy. I think what comes out from the discussion on whether or not the EU is intergovernmental or not is a kind of vagueness with regard to who actually decides in EU foreign policy. Is it the largest member states? Is it the European Commission? Is it a collective of member states and institutions? Maybe this varies from decision to decision. So from a legitimacy perspective and from a democratic perspective, the question then is, who should we hold accountable, and who should hold those deciding accountable? Can the mandate for EU foreign policy still be traced back to the representatives of the citizens of the member states? In the first bargaining account, the answer is a clear yes. In the two other accounts, perhaps less so. Well, what then about the European Parliament? The European Parliament has increasing power in foreign and security policy, but it's still limited. It has budgetary powers. It can question the High Representative and Commission in terms of what they are doing in external policies, but it does not authorize foreign policy. So one debate that arises as a result of a move of these observations that the European Union has moved beyond intergovernmentalism has to do with the legitimacy basis and of the policy itself. Some would argue that that one position would be to say that there is a tendency to a democratic deficit as a result of such a move. Others would argue that what we observe is actually a democratic surplus. Now, how do they get to that argument? That would be linked to the idea that the legitimacy of this policy is enhanced due to the process of justification that goes on between member states within the European Union context. And the demand of the EU constitution that policies are justified with reference to the norms and principles that are enshrined in the EU's constitutive document. So a kind of double control of foreign policy that you will not have if member states were making their policy decisions on their own. So this is a kind of argument that you would find also in analysis of international organizations. There is an article that I can send you the reference for that by Helene Sjursen and Macedo that argues that international organizations provide a democratic surplus and not a democratic deficit due to these control mechanisms and checks that arise when states act together and have to justify their position to other actors before policy is actually decided. And they add to their argument that also constitutional democracies isolate decisions in foreign and security policy from citizens' representatives. So they claim that the difference is not that large between decision-making procedures in international organizations or in the European Union in this policy field, not that different from decision-making in individual member states. I would still hold that if we take the move beyond intergovernmentalism in foreign and security policy seriously, we also need to take seriously the democratic expectation that decisions should be traceable back to a mandate by citizens, and that this might require a further strengthening of the power of the European Parliament in order to ensure that this democratic principle is respected. So on that note, I think I will stop